Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you again for taking the time out of your busy schedules this Tuesday to come join us. My name is Sergio Alcobilia. I'm with the ACLU of Hawaii. I just wanted to take this moment to welcome you folks. Thank you. I know folks are still trickling in, so we're going to make them sit in the front. And Ian is also recording this presentation that we'll make available on our website as well. I just wanted to say thank you for everyone for taking the time to come. Especially want to say thank you to Juliet and the First Unitarian Church for co-hosting this event with us, and I just wanted to turn it over to Juliet.
Anyway, we're really glad to see you here, and I hope we'll do this again. Haven't finished up just yet. I'm on the board of the Unitarian Church, and we're sponsoring, and we're grateful to be able to have this today. And come and see us on Sunday, okay?
Okay, and I won't take too much time. I'll go ahead and we'll get started. I'd like to introduce our senior staff attorney, Emily Hills, who will be doing the presentation. There's a few of us also from the ACLU team that'll be here, and we can also take questions afterwards. But I'll go ahead and turn it over to Emily Hills, our senior staff attorney at the ACLU of Hawaii.
Okay, can you all hear me? Okay. I know I can sometimes speak really quietly, so please, if I get quiet, just like shout or raise your hand and let me know. So as Sergio said, I'm Emily Hills. I'm senior staff attorney at the ACLU of Hawaii. A little bit about me and my perspective just going into this. So I'm a lawyer. I've worked as a public defender, a judicial law clerk, a legal services provider at the Legal Aid Society of Hawaii, and now I'm at the ACLU, where I mostly sue the government to enforce the Constitution. And so tonight, this is Join the Resistance, How to Push Back Against Authoritarianism. Click, please. Click, please. Thank you. So just a teensy bit about the ACLU of Hawaii, because we do have a lot to get through tonight. We are a nonprofit. That means we aren't doing this for money. We're nonpartisan, meaning we're not political. I shouldn't say we're not political. We're not supporting any particular political party. We're really a civil rights, civil liberties watchdog, and as I said, our goal is to enforce the Constitution and everybody's civil rights. So we do that in a variety of different ways through litigation, that's the department that I'm in, policy, advocacy, lobbying, organizing, and public education like tonight. Next slide, please. So, deep breath. I wanted to take a moment to acknowledge everything that is going on right now and how I know that many of us are feeling overwhelmed, defeated, totally at a loss. Today is the one-year anniversary of the inauguration. Yesterday, we honored the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King. And I know that the killing of Renee Good came as a shock to many, that the administration's response has been even more shocking. And so I just want to acknowledge a deep breath. It's a lot. My goal for us tonight is to put our analytical hats on and figure out what we can collectively do to push back. So I will be referencing everything that's happening in Minneapolis and around the country. Unfortunately, there's a lot of really good illustrations about how authoritarianism can grow. But the focus is going to be on understanding how what's happening fits into the bigger picture and what we might be able to do about it. So without further ado, next slide, please. Our agenda for this evening, we have 4 main points that I want to cover. First is just kind of basics. What is authoritarianism? And for people who are still wondering, is the situation really that dire? The answer is yes. Then we're going to turn to democratic resilience and what rights in particular do we need to protect in order to prevent democratic backsliding. Is this what made that weird noise? Okay. It's like in my mouth. Okay. Third topic, right, how do we resist kind of collectively the rise of authoritarianism? I'm going to be talking about civil resistance and concrete objectives for civil resistance. And then sort of this last bucket is what can I individually actually do, and how can we stay safe while we're doing it? Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Thank you. So I'm a lawyer, right? I have to add a disclaimer to all my presentations. This presentation is for informational purposes only. It is not legal advice. If you have a specific situation, please, you can file an intake with the ACLU or call a lawyer. I also have started adding this caveat that as I'm going to be talking about our various constitutional rights and laws that might apply to various situations, I cannot guarantee that the current administration is going to be following the law. So in any given situation, we're going to talk about it. You'll have to kind of assess your own risk. All right, next slide, please. So, and I'm sorry, there's going to be a click kind of quickly. What is authoritarianism? Authoritarianism is a political system, it's a government structure that's characterized by the rejection of plurality, that means kind of rejection of diversity of thought, and the use of a strong central power to preserve status quo. Can you click, please? So this is a really complicated topic. I am not a political scientist. Authoritarianism is a broad category that's related to many more specific forms of government, from totalitarianism, fascism, oligarchy. I'm not going to go into today what all of those are, where we think this country might be going, because frankly, I don't know. But I am going to be focusing on authoritarianism more generally. There's a huge caveat to this. If we can click, please. So I am not talking about political viewpoint, because authoritarianism can arise in both a liberal and a conservative context. And I'm not talking about economic structures, right? Same kind of idea. Authoritarianism can arise regardless of which economic system a country is following. So today, I'm really mostly talking about power and the consolidation of power. And there's really not a one-to-one comparison between viewpoint or economic structure and authoritarianism. I also wanted to point out, I hope it goes without saying, that resisting the fall of democracy should be a nonpartisan issue. And the more that we turn it into a partisan problem, the less effective resistance is going to be. So get it clear up front, right? Authoritarianism is about the use of a strong central power to prevent diversity of thought in a society. Not a partisan issue. This is an everyone issue. Next slide, please. So, big picture, how did we get here? Because I think we need to know how we got here to figure out how to get out of it. There's a lot of different theories, but the most convincing one that I've heard recently is that our government on both sides has stopped being responsive to what people actually need. There's a variety of different theories about which parts of our government were non-responsive and why. Things that have been thrown around are income gap, healthcare inequality, education inequality. But the real point is authoritarianism thrives when there's a gap between an unresponsive government and the people's unmet needs. In other words, when people's needs aren't being met by the existing government, people are vulnerable to persuasion that a strong central authority will fix all of their problems. And so as we talk about different strategies for resistance and what it might take to kind of turn our democracy around, we also need to be thinking about, I suppose, what will fix this gap problem. Because as I think we sort of saw after the 2020 election and then what happened again in 2024, if needs aren't met, if we don't figure out how to turn that around, then we are going to keep sliding into authoritarianism, frankly, regardless of who is in power. So next slide, please. Okay. Big picture, authoritarianism boils down to one main idea. An authoritarian government seeks to control people to maintain its power. The categories that I have listed here are just examples of how governments are able to accomplish that. Next slide, please. Okay. So we can see, right, if you, as a government actor, want to have a central power to stay in power, to prevent diversity of thought or plurality, there's only kind of a variety of strategies that you might be able to use, right? Suppressing dissent, manipulating national identity, militarization, secret police, making sure that you have control over elections, because free and fair elections are going to be very threatening to a government that wants to kind of stay in power in perpetuity. and to the same kind of end, right, rejecting checks and balances. So I'm going to go through all of kind of these categories and what we're seeing today, but I wanted to take a pause to be real for a second. If we can have a next slide. Next slide, please. Thank you. Even in the US, which we consider a democratic republic, we are not perfect. And minorities and communities of color have had authoritarian type control levied against them. Can you click, please? Okay. Right, the illegal overthrow of the Hawaiian Kingdom, the Trail of Tears, Japanese internment, persecutions of the LGBT community, Jim Crow in the 1960s civil rights movement, even Black Lives Matter movement. Right, our country has grappled with authoritarian control before. And I think our takeaway from this should be twofold. First off, our country has never been perfect. It's never going to be perfect. We have backslid before, we'll probably backslide again. But history has been moving in a trajectory towards recognizing the value and dignity of all people. And that's a trajectory we don't want reversed right now. I think the second takeaway is that people are resilient, communities are resilient, and that we can take lessons from the struggles of the past. So next slide, please. Are we really sliding towards authoritarianism? Yes, sorry. I know that I'm probably preaching to the choir here, that most people came tonight because you're convinced that we are on a democratic backslide and want to know how to get out of it. But I'm including this section to, number one, talk about what authoritarian struggles were or strategies that we're seeing the current administration using. And two, to help give you talking points, because as I'm going to talk about in the what do we do about it section, I'm hoping that you can leave tonight as ambassadors to build larger, broader coalitions of resistance. So next slide. I think the first kind of question that often comes up when we're looking at should we be worried about authoritarianism is, yeah, things seem crazy in some areas of the country, or there might be some bad things that are happening, but most things are still normal. And the dual state theory of dictatorship explains why. The Dual State is a book written by Ernest Fraenkel. He was a Jewish labor lawyer who fled Nazi Germany with a manuscript. And he published The Dual State, a contribution to the theory of dictatorship. In it, he explained how even with the rise of Nazi power in Germany, things were normal for the vast majority of German citizens. There was a normal capitalist economy governed by stable laws. But at the same time, the state was consolidating power and had kind of established this secondary state of lawlessness in which regular laws don't apply, there's increased oppression and violence, and there's kind of this idea that the government can really use force to do whatever it wants. And next slide, please. What he noticed happening was that on any given day, people could be jerked out of this normative state and into what he called it the prerogative state, where the government has the prerogative to do whatever they want. I read a really interesting op-ed, I think in the New York Times, floating that this theory actually helps explain what happened to Renee Good in Minnesota. That we can look at the videos of what was happening, we can listen to her comments of, I'm not mad at you, dude. Like, she believed that she was in the normative state, and in the normative state, protesters don't get shot just for protesting. In the normative state, your life does not depend on immediately following arguably conflicting orders from law enforcement. She believed she was in the normative state, but she had actually, in confronting ICE on that particular occasion, crossed over into the prerogative state. And in the prerogative state, survival and safety is subject to the whims of the government, not the rule of law. So now let's talk about how we can understand sort of what's happening nationally on a more specific level. Next slide, please. All right, coming back to this kind of idea, I want to talk about the suppression of dissent quickly. And I'm going to try to go through this a little quickly, so I'm sorry, there's going to be a lot of clicks. Next slide, please. We are seeing censorship, propaganda, and disinformation at sort of, it seems to me at least, record levels. Right? We are seeing unprecedented efforts to control speech and the press, to control what people are allowed to say and not say. And we're seeing that sort of through, I kind of piled up these headlines of different lawsuits. But we're also seeing it in terms of who is getting arrested, who is getting picked up for immigration enforcement. We're seeing courts who are ruling that somebody was in deportation proceedings because of their speech. So this is happening on a variety of contexts. Next slide, please. We're also seeing an alarming attempt at disinformation kind of across the board. And as I'm going to discuss very soon, vilification of anybody who opposes the current administration. I think this example of labeling Renee Good as a domestic terrorist is a fairly good example of that. Next slide, please. We are also seeing specific words getting prohibited. This email I pulled from actually a lawsuit that the ACLU is involved in, where Head Start centers were told that they had to avoid particular words. They were given a list of 200 words that they could not use in their applications for funding. And those words, as the headline kind of mentioned, include disability, includes women, includes female or females as well. Again, this is a level of control over speech, and I think ultimately an attempt at a level of control over thought or what people are allowed to say that's really alarming and unusual. Next slide, please. So manipulating the national identity, right? I think the first thing at least that comes to mind for me when I think about this, I think for a lot of people, is sort of how the Nazi regime preyed on this idea of nationalism and national identity and the superiority of the Aryan race and kind of took all that and muddled it together and then used it to motivate people and to believe that the regime was acting in their interests. We are seeing a similar kind of use of the American national identity, including vilifications of others, as well as co-opting history. So next slide, please. Right, this began during the first Trump administration, but there has been kind of an extraordinarily awful vilification of immigrants in particular. And I highlighted some of these sentences, right? No, they're not humans. They're not humans, they're animals. Saying that immigrants coming to this country are poisoning the blood of our country, which is in fact a phrase that was wildly used by Adolf Hitler. This idea that anybody who doesn't belong to his coalition is kind of other. Next slide, please. We also saw this starting to happen actually immediately following the killing of Renee Good, when there started to be this kind of new vilification of particularly white women, which is traditionally not the demographic group that has been vilified through other campaigns. But that started to be the rhetoric around what happened to Miss Good, that she somehow deserved to be killed or could have been killed, that it was somehow justified because she was part of this demographic that's awful. Like that literally was the acronym that's on there. I do have to add, for completeness sake, I did see a headline. I was frantically checking the news right before this to make sure that I was up to date. I did see a headline that apparently that's been walked back. The headline at least was saying that President Trump learned that her father was a Trump supporter and has now said that her shooting was a terrible tragedy. So, yeah. I can't vouch for the truthfulness. I just saw the headline, but I wanted to flag it because this might be slightly outdated now. All right, next slide, please. We are also seeing, I call this the co-opting of history. I had a colleague tell me it should be really kind of the rewriting of history. But really what we're seeing is that the history of America is getting used to kind of further specific goals of the administration, whether it really belongs there or not. I flagged this executive order that was issued almost a year ago now about ending radical indoctrination. It effectively bans teaching about the civil rights movement, the civil rights era, slavery, racism, as well as LGBT communities, and pretty much anything that they consider discriminatory equity ideology. And at the same time, it kind of is establishing the 1776 Commission and saying that it needs to glorify our glorious American history as if civil rights and all of that is not part of our history. Next slide, please. We are also seeing this happen even in kind of more recent events. This is an article from January 16th about an investigation into what happened on January 6th, where journalists are sort of raising the alarm that there's a lot of false and misleading claims that are being made. There's concerns that basically the history of what happened is now being rewritten. Okay, next slide. We are also seeing the demise of democracy. Next slide, please. Right under this category, I kind of put constraining voting rights, manipulating elections, rejecting the rule of law. There's a lawsuit pending. Actually, ACLU of Hawaii just got involved in it last week, where the Trump administration is working on creating a national voter record database. And they've been very transparent that one of the goals is to force states to remove voters from their registration lists. There's also concerns about what else might be done with that list, and whether even the compilation of the list is designed to sort of chill people's interest in exercising the right to vote. Next slide, please. We've been seeing this. I highlighted, that went too fast, sorry. I highlighted the potential for trying to reduce the number of people who are able to vote by saying states can't use voting machines, by saying states can't do mail-in voting. All of that is really left to the states under the Constitution. It's not something that the federal government really has any business being in. States get to choose how they run their own elections. But again, we're seeing that sort of overreach, particularly in the context of elections. As well as all of this talk about potentially running for a third term, notwithstanding what's in the 22nd Amendment. And then finally, next slide, please. The most recent thing that I saw was saying maybe we shouldn't even have an election if midterms are going to go badly. I'm hoping it's just hyperbole, but we also know that the administration is very good, I guess to their credit, about following through with a lot of the promises that are made. And so I see this sort of rhetoric as certainly something like a big red flag. And the last category I want to talk about, next slide please, is just militarization. And I'm just trying to go quickly. It's not that I don't think checks and balances are worth talking about, but militarization, I think we can all think about what is happening in Minneapolis right now. Next slide, please. I just pulled one really alarming story since I've been talking about Renee Good a lot. Post that with everything that is happening in terms of ICE breaking windows, using battering rams to pull people out of their homes without warrants. There was this really sad story about a family of children, or a family with 6 children who were tear gassed. They were trying to escape from an area of a protest. According to the news article, the baby, who was 6 months old, actually stopped breathing during this incident. Right? We're seeing increased use of force, and frankly, force that really isn't justified under the Constitution. And it means that uninvolved parties are getting caught in the crossfire. All right, next slide. So what do we have to protect in order to prevent democratic backsliding? And when I'm saying democratic backsliding, I'm talking about the process of transformation of a democratic system into an authoritarian system, which is sort of the process that I was describing. Next slide, please. So within these categories, this is sort of my own take on it. I think, if you don't mind clicking, right, to suppress dissent, to vilify others, we really need strong freedom of speech, freedom of press, freedom of assembly. These rights are critical and need to be kind of a priority for protecting. Click, please. Right? To prevent against militarization and the demise of democracy, we really need a strong rule of law. We have a constitution, we have a federal constitution, we have state constitutions, we have all kinds of federal statutes that are designed to protect against authoritarianism. And those need to be enforced and they need to be followed. And then finally, we need to make sure that separation of powers is maintained and respected. And I'm including in that bucket federalism because there are some things that are left specifically to the states that the states, as like mini laboratories of experimentation, get to be in control of. And it's critical that the federal government does not overstep that. And it's also critical that the federal government respect the checks and balances that the other branches of government may be imposing. And I think we're seeing this kind of most starkly in the litigation that has been brought challenging policies by the current administration. And judges are largely, I think I saw a statistic that it was like 64 or 67% of the litigation that's been brought has been successful already, with judges saying that whatever happened was illegal or unconstitutional or against the law. And that needs to be followed because right now I can tell you that we are actually facing, ACLU of Hawaii is facing a case where a court has already said that a government policy is illegal and the government is saying, but we can keep using it because the court didn't tell us we have to stop. So that's where we are right now. That's what we're seeing. So next slide, please. Let's talk about democratic resilience. And the first category within that is sort of breakdown resilience, which is a system's ability to prevent the breakdown of democracy. And in that scenario, studies have shown it is possible to kind of prevent the collapse of a democracy. The way to do it is to build a broad electoral coalition of pro-democracy opposition. It means that there needs to be a way to combat disinformation in real time, and it's dependent on a really strong judiciary. Next slide, please. There is also this idea of bounce-back resilience, which is kind of resisting the stabilization of autocracy. So once a system has slid into authoritarianism, can it bounce back? And the answer is yes, yes it can. What the system needs are strong institutional safeguards. And this study found that an independent judiciary is decisive in examples of this around the world. But also the continued protection of free and fair elections, as well as societal collective action, meaning kind of broad opposition coalitions, and I'm going to talk about that more in a second, as well as mass mobilization. And it did flag, this was really interesting to me, that actually it's not protests. Mass mobilization doesn't mean protesting, and they actually saw that protests could backfire. Because protests often gave authoritarian governments excuses to be able to use increased violence. Okay, next slide, please. What the study did find in terms of can a society bounce back is that acting in the early stages is of paramount importance. They found that autocracies that don't bounce back after 4 to 6 years are going to have a huge uphill battle. It's much easier to bounce back when autocracy hasn't yet been stabilized and when civil resistance can focus on making sure that it doesn't become a stable autocracy. So next slide, please. So what can we do to resist the rise of authoritarianism? I'm going to talk kind of big picture first, and then I'm going to talk kind of more specific actions. So if we can go to the next slide. The answer really is civil resistance, which sometimes gets termed people power or termed, I guess, just resistance. This civil resistance as a term, it was coined by Gandhi. It's a strategy of resistance that's actually been used for centuries. And click, please. It involves a number of different strategies that are customized to a particular situation, to a resistor's particular goals. But overall, right, it's a method of active conflict in which unarmed people use a variety of coordinated methods to promote change without harming or threatening to harm an opponent. Civil refers to nonviolent. It doesn't mean friendly or polite. And as I'm going to talk about, civil resistance actually needs to be quite unpolite, and in the lay sense, uncivil. I do need to flag here, I owe a huge debt to scholar Erica Chenoweth. I brought her book today. They have it at the library. She wrote a book called Civil Resistance. She's one of the forerunners of doing kind of political science research in this area. So I'm pulling very heavily from her scholarship here. Next slide, please. Kind of one of the most important parts about civil resistance is that it be unarmed, nonviolent action. That's absolutely critical. Right, I have a picture here of Rosa Parks and her decision not to move when she was told she had to give up her seat on the bus, but she didn't fight back. And actually, during the civil rights movement, resistors or people who were engaging in these nonviolent protests would practice how to respond to threats, how to respond to aggression without escalating, without fighting back. Because the minute somebody starts fighting back or starts responding to threats, it can legitimize the use of force against them, and it can actually legitimize a crackdown on the entire civil resistance movement. On the other hand, use of nonviolent protests, nonviolent movements or strategies like a bus boycott, like a sit-in, can actually be extremely effective, even or even especially when violence is used. So click, please. As we know from the civil rights movement, right, nonviolent action does not mean that the people resisting are not going to face harm. And it doesn't mean that the regime is not going to use violence against the resistors. But what studies have shown is when a civil resistance movement is nonviolent, use of force by by the authoritarian government can actually really backfire, right? It can actually draw support in. So the use of nonviolence is critical. Next slide, please. And I think to that point, data has shown, these are actually graphs that came from Erica Chenoweth. Civil resistance works. It's actually significantly more effective than violent resisting or a violent uprising. And it defies some common assumptions, like the idea that you can only fight force with force. I'm not going to go into all the hypotheses about why civil resistance is significantly more effective than violent resistance. But the fact that we know it's not only effective, but more effective, sort of begs this question of why and how does civil resistance work? So next slide, please. All governments, but particularly an authoritarian government that is trying to centralize authority and control people, depends on pillars of support. This is just an illustration that I literally made in PowerPoint. Different scholars have theorized which sectors count. Usually there's more than 4 pillars of support. I think one of the articles I was reading said 9 pillars, but said there were 4 key pillars for preventing democratic backsliding in particular. These are just examples based on what I'm kind of going to be talking about today. But effective civil resistance, click please, uses a wide variety of strategies to weaken an authoritarian government's different support systems. And so that's why civil resistance can work, and it can work really effectively, is that it specifically and strategically targets the different pillars of support that are kind of propping up an authoritarian government. So the question for everyone to ask, next slide please, is what does an authoritarian government need? And this question is going to be different for every society. It might even be different in every state here, right? And I think I kind of put some ideas on here, right? Public cooperation, a functioning bureaucracy. All governments need a functioning bureaucracy. Financial and moral support from the business sector, obedient security forces. And you sort of, the goal would be to list out the different things that are supporting an authoritarian government and then figure out how to address those. I flagged here the whistles in Minneapolis, which I absolutely love, are a really good example of nonviolent civil resistance, right? The whistles are really easy to distribute. They are targeting, in particular, immigration enforcement's ability to operate sort of in privacy or in secrecy. They're a way to alert people that an immigration operation is happening. They're there to invite legal observers, so they actually serve a really practical purpose. But I've also at least read online and social media that they're very, very annoying. So they also sort of up the cost of the different authoritarian actions that are happening in Minneapolis right now. I think another example of this, click please, is some of the protesting that we saw around kind of DOGE and what was happening during the early months of the Trump administration. But targeting business interests in the business sector can be really effective. That's actually credited with taking down apartheid in South Africa. And so we saw this happening in this one context here, but we can all think about sort of what other forms of protest or targeting might be effective in this situation. Click please. I can't vouch for the veracity of this one, but I saw it going around social media a lot. I kind of hope it's true. But when immigration enforcement unveiled their new hotline, right, everybody was posting, or lots of people were posting online, right, whatever you do, don't call the hotline and report Anne Frank. Again, right? I mean, it makes us all laugh, right? It's silly. It kind of highlights some of the injustices in what is currently happening with immigration enforcement. But it also actually has a practical purpose in terms of making that hotline a lot less effective. So upping the cost of running the hotline, making the administration wade through high volume of useless calls. This would all kind of be the opposite of public cooperation. Next slide, please. Mass participation is probably going to be determinative. So I highlighted this quote, right? The larger and more diverse the campaign's base of participants, the more likely it is to succeed. And the key here is not only size, but diversity. Successful civil resistance movements pull in people from a variety of demographics. This enables the campaign to strategically deploy strategies in different sectors, and it ensures that any mass demonstration, strike, or other act of resistance is going to be keenly felt by the entire country. Mass participation also makes it more difficult for a regime to crack down on dissidents. So some of you might have heard, click please, this 3.5% rule, which does have, I put an asterisk on here, but this rule, it was coined by, I keep saying her name, Erica Chenoweth, but I've heard it quoted through a number of different trainings happening kind of these days. The idea is that no revolutions have failed after 3.5% of the population actively participated in an observable peak. There's an asterisk on no. I think there were two exceptions. Both involved unusual circumstances and situations where the mass participation was very short-lived. But what's kind of critical is it illustrates what it means by mass participation. I kind of put the numbers on here, right? Hawaii's population, 3.5% would be about 50,000 people participating in a particular event. For the US as a whole, we're talking about like 12 million people, which is about the population size of Illinois. And I think we can all imagine how difficult and what it might take to get that many people mobilized and participating in civil resistance. Now, I think the other big caveat, while I hear this rule getting used a lot, I don't believe it has been studied or that there's been a lot of assessments in terms of how it applies to a democratic breakdown as opposed to a situation where there is a strong authoritarian regime. It's possible it will take less than 3.5% of the population, but I think that's certainly a good kind of benchmark to aim for. Next slide, please. Defection is going to be critical. So defection happens when a person or organization who has been a support to the regime, so for example, a civil servant, a member of security forces, decides not to actively support the regime anymore, either across the board or in a particular situation. So for example, there have been documented incidents of security forces refusing to open fire on civilians or refusing to deploy chemical agents, right? Orders getting lost or misunderstood, people being clumsy, careless, et cetera, foot dragging. All of this makes it more difficult for an authoritarian regime to maintain control. It drives up the cost of executing an authoritarian agenda. And if there are enough defections, particularly of security forces, the regime will collapse. In civil resistance campaigns that were fighting against democratic backsliding in particular, outreach was actually the most successful strategy in shifting pillar loyalty. So my takeaway from all of this is we cannot put up a wall between ourselves and the people who are currently making up the pillars of support. We cannot make the cost, the social cost of defection so high that people are unwilling to admit they might have put their faith in an administration that is undemocratic. Click, please. This need for defection is one reason that nonviolence is so important, because nonviolence makes defections much more likely. That's been borne out in the data. And I think the next question, right, is why do people defect? Sometimes it's a moral imperative. I think that's sort of what we're seeing now in defections that are happening. Sometimes it's social pressure. Sometimes it's concern about family or friends. There are documented incidents of security forces refusing to fire on protesters because they thought family might have been in that protest. And then, of course, people will also defect for self-interested reasons, which is not necessarily a bad reason, right? But self-interested reasons like it doesn't make economic sense to support the administration anymore, right? That was what happened really with apartheid in South Africa because the boycotts were so successful. Or maybe someone just doesn't want to be on the wrong side of history as a movement gains momentum. So kind of as we're talking and as you're thinking about this, how do we resist? Think about how can we get defection? Because that's kind of going to be, I think, decisive. So next slide, please. In my opinion, and this is my personal opinion, I tried to kind of distill out what I think really needs to happen. And I've been thinking hard about kind of all of the research that I've been doing. These are kind of my personal takeaways. There needs to be a unifying and focused vision that transcends party lines. In order to get mass participation in any resistance movement, it has to pull in a wide variety of people from a broad spectrum. Bonus points, and I think possibly necessary, if that can also address sort of the underlying, thank you. the underlying causes of authoritarianism, or of why we slid into authoritarianism in the first place. As I kind of talked about, we're going to need sustained and widespread participation. There needs to be protection of voting rights. That's probably one of the top priorities. But an election, I do want to say, right, an election, I said this isn't a partisan problem. An election's not going to fix everything. We have to address the reasons this is happening, or we're going to bounce back. There also needs to be an effective means of combating disinformation and propaganda. Judges need to be committed to judicial independence, and we need to make sure that it's safe for them to be independent. And then kind of to this last defection point, there needs to be open lines of communication with security forces, meaning local police, military, immigration, National Guard, etc. There needs to be a dialogue between any civil resistance movement and the security forces. Okay, so next slide, please. I told you guys all I'd start with like really big picture, and then I'd kind of give some more specifics. Okay, what can we actually do, and how can we be safe while we do it? Next slide, please. So to kind of take the second question first, let's talk about risk. I sort of laid out, right, every action we take in life, honestly, we're toggling risk constantly. But particularly when we're talking about opposing people in power, we need to be thinking about where we stand on sort of a risk scale. And this is why I wanted to talk about this normative versus prerogative state at the beginning, because I think each person's individual risk is going to depend a lot on whether they're in the normative state or in the prerogative state. And unfortunately, you don't get to control whether you're in the normative or prerogative state. That's sort of the government that's making that decision. You know, levels of risk are also going to depend on each person's personal demographics. We know there are certain demographics that are being targets for immigration enforcement, whether someone is a citizen or not. But certainly someone who is not a citizen might be at heightened risk. And I think we can all think about other demographics that might be at more or less risk depending on what they're doing. So this is sort of my best guess would be, if you don't mind clicking, less risky actions would be, say, state law advocacy. I'm going to talk about some legislation that's kind of being proposed. Legislature is opening tomorrow. I say probably less risky because that's not putting someone directly in conflict with the federal government. Another less risky, but not completely risk-free, would be kind of diffuse resistance, meaning different resistance that makes makes someone less identifiable as an individual, so like participating in boycotts. On the other end of the scale, click please, targeted resistance, meaning resistance where someone is personally identifiable. And I went back and forth with everything going on in Minneapolis. Should this be orange? Should this be red? Should this be bright red? It's somewhere in that spectrum, right? And then I put definitely on bright red. Anything that would legitimize the use of force against you. So disobeying orders, breaking the law, that's all likely to escalate a situation and make it less safe. All right, so having talked about risk, let's talk about these kind of concrete steps that people can take. Next slide, please. I put this first because this is something that not only takes extreme courage and mental preparation, but because it's so critical. You have to exercise your constitutional rights. It may well be, and I get this question a lot, that the current administration will not respect constitutional rights. That's certainly a pattern we're seeing. I included this photo of immigration using a battering ram to break into a home in Minneapolis without a judicial warrant. It's now the subject of litigation. So they might not honor our constitutional rights. But every time we exercise our rights, we're reminding ourselves, the government, and everybody watching that those rights exist and they are important. I'm not underestimating how hard it will be to face down people in masks, tactical gear, demanding compliance, and I'm definitely not advocating for anybody to stand on their rights to the point of bodily harm. But if we choose in advance not to exercise our constitutional rights, then they might as well not exist at all. Next slide, please. To that end, I put attending protests and demonstrations. You can certainly follow ACLU of Hawaii. There are other organizations I listed indivisible here as one to find out about protests that are happening. Protests can be great for kind of building momentum in a movement, bringing people together, showing broad public support for an idea or a goal. But I do have this caveat listed on here because I kind of had the caveat earlier that protesting can backfire. Protesting has to be paired with other civil resistance strategies to be truly effective. Protesting on its own is not going to get the job done. And on a similar vein, next slide, please. Beware of, I call this clicktivism, or I think I actually saw someone say clicktivism, right? Liking, sharing, making social media posts, they all feel really good, but it's actually not accomplishing very much. Maybe, right, it is exercising First Amendment rights, but the way social media works, algorithms mean that your likes, shares, posts probably are only going to people who already agree with you. I also wanted to flag, right, I put on this picture the police chasing bathtub Viking. I laughed so hard I almost cried when I saw this video. It's a video of a man in a Viking hat in a bathtub rolling down the street being chased by like 15 ICE agents. It's amazing, but it also never happened. Artificial intelligence created this video. I think that's one of the biggest risks about social media right now, is that there's a lot of disinformation swirling around there. And I also wanted to flag social media does have a mixed reputation in civil resistance movements because it can also be used by the authoritarian government to entrap people, to target supporters, even to sort of kind of send their own disinformation. So use with caution. Another strategy that you can use, thank you. Be a legal observer. This is something that we're seeing a lot in Minneapolis right now. A legal observer is somebody who attends events or other government actions where there is a potential for conflict with the government. The legal observer's job is to observe and document, and that means you're exercising your First Amendment right to record. You don't have to have a training, you don't have to be certified to be a legal observer. I do think it's a good idea to get some information. So I put on the link, all of these slides are up on our website. I put a link to the ACLU of Hawaii's Legal Observer Training. Another one that's really reputable is the National Lawyers Guild program. And on a similar vein, I know that there are efforts in place right now to try to also create legal observers for, say, immigration court, to kind of keep track of what is happening in immigration proceedings. And you might be seeing kind of other efforts to mobilize people to do legal observation. I think as we all sort of saw with what happened to Renee Good, documentation, observation and documentation is critical, particularly because we're seeing so much propaganda and disinformation. So in terms of in-person kind of civil resistance, click please. I did want to flag some of the legal limits that we should all be aware of. Right? There's always, and I mentioned it, right? There's always the risk the government's not going to follow the Constitution, but there's also some laws that we are seeing kind of get weaponized against protesters, and you want to make sure that you're kind of staying on the legal side of things, right? One law that's getting thrown around a lot right now, and actually the judge that's on this slide, she did end up getting convicted of obstruction, is purposefully interfering with a government operation. I put lawful in here. That's a defense if the operation is unlawful, but certainly interfering with a government operation is going to expose you to potential legal liability for obstruction. I also put disorderly conduct on here. That's actually, an offense you see more commonly prosecuted under state law, but it's certainly on the table for people to be arrested for. Disorderly conduct really criminalizes speech that is not protected under our Constitution. So threatening, making threats, fighting words, actually fighting, which is not really speech, obscenity, unreasonable noise, which I have not actually seen used in this context, but is usually part of the definition, or kind of any behavior that's likely to incite an immediate breach of the peace. I think we can all kind of imagine how this could get used, particularly in like a heightened protest situation. So I wanted to flag it. Two more, next slide, please. We are seeing the administration saying that people who support sort of immigrants are harboring or concealing. That's certainly a charge that's being levied against sanctuary jurisdictions as well. Harboring means knowingly or recklessly transporting, concealing, shielding from detection an undocumented immigrant. There's also kind of a separate statute of concealing somebody from a lawful arrest that actually the judge on the last slide was also charged with. And the last one that gets used or is getting used right now is kind of the criminalization of material support of terrorism. And there are some free speech limits on this. Generally, material support means concrete support, so provision of property, services, money, lodging, training, like something concrete. But it can also apply to speech under the direction of or in coordination with terrorist organizations. And I flag this in part because we are seeing the administration sort of brand anybody who opposes them as a domestic terrorist. And I think we don't know yet how this law is going to apply in that situation or what courts are going to do when the administration's objectives come up against free speech. Another reason why we need an independent judiciary. So takeaways from this, next slide please. Strategies for safer, I'm not gonna say totally safe, in-person engagement. I would say carry a copy of your passport or your visa. Something that if you are arrested by immigration enforcement or even by local police, you can show that you are a citizen, that they can't hold you for violation of immigration laws. Memorize critical phone numbers, because if you get arrested, you might not have access to your phone, and I think you definitely don't want to be voluntarily unlocking your phone while under arrest to be able to get those numbers. So make sure you have 1 or 2 numbers memorized. Tell people where you're going and what you're doing. Make sure you can't be disappeared. This one, carry cash in case you're arrested. This is a tip, I've heard this specifically for people who might be arrested for violation of immigration law, but I think it could apply to anybody in a protest situation. We've been told that if somebody is arrested and they have cash on them, that cash will be put into their books at like the federal detention center. And so cash is going to give you access to use the phone, to be able to send emails, to be able to buy necessities much more quickly. This one makes me really sad, but eat or drink beforehand. Because we are hearing about even citizens getting arrested in Minneapolis, being held for 8 or more hours, being provided with really inadequate nutrition, water. So please don't be hungry when you get arrested. And then finally, I flagged this on the risk assessment too, right? Obey orders. Even if you think they're unlawful, I would never advise someone not to obey an order because that escalates the situation so much it makes it really risky. It's better to obey and then fight it on the back end. And you can do an intake to the ACLU of Hawaii. I can't promise we'll help you, but it's good to know. Outside of kind of in-person direct engagement, what else can people do? Next slide, please. Participate in the legislative process. We have some of our policy team here. I think the Hawaii State Legislative Session is starting tomorrow. There are going to be several bills addressing authoritarianism, including this no secret police bill and a SHIELD law that's to protect providers of gender-affirming care. So calling legislators, whether federal and state or county, it really does actually make a difference. This is something that we get told over and over again. Even if you think your representative is already supportive, calling or writing kind of gives them more data to decide how hard to push or how much of a priority something should be. And then going to testify actually makes an even bigger difference. This is probably not really fair, but what we hear is that legislators are often considering the number of people testifying as sort of a litmus test for how the community feels about something. And so we actually saw this sort of happen with the SHIELD law that was proposed last legislative session, where there was a huge mobilization against it and not quite as much of a mobilization to support it, and the law ended up not getting passed. In a similar vein, next slide, please. Call or write to the governor. Here in Hawaii, our state is fighting back against the administration. We're parties to a number of different lawsuits. We refused to voluntarily turn over our voter records, and now there's a lawsuit against the state. But it's really important to let the state know that that matters to you, that they need to keep fighting that fight. I put the contact info on the slide. You can get to it from our website. You can even request a personal meeting for yourself or your coalition, or at a minimum, kind of write to the governor who's in charge of the Attorney General's office, and let him know that this is an important fight. You can also, on a different vein, next slide please, support organizations that are under threat. There are so many different organizations that have lost federal funding, significant federal funding recently. This is just kind of a sampling of what I could come up with off the top of my head, right? But supporting organizations that give the public free access to information, such as Hawaii Public Radio, the Hawaii State Library, immigration legal services in particular have lost a lot of funding. And so I flagged kind of 3 service providers that are providing kind of low cost or no cost legal services that really could use help. Next slide, please. I would be remiss if I didn't also say please support the organizations that are fighting back against what's happening. I put the ACLU of Hawaii on here. We filed last year 239 legal actions against the Trump administration. Last week, the ACLU of Hawaii added 2 to that number. We filed 2 lawsuits in the same week. But we're not the only organization. This isn't a pitch. You can use the QR code to become a member, but there are other organizations who are also doing this work, right? Lambda Legal is fighting on behalf of the LGBT community. Democracy Forward is fighting. And I think I put this in a similar category of like independent media that might not have lost federal funding necessarily, but are doing really important work in terms of reporting and analyzing what is happening right now. So what are we likely to kind of see going forward in terms of civil resistance? Next slide, please. I think the next steps are going to be, hopefully, seeing more calls to action, right? We need to move out of the realm of protest and into additionally kind of diffuse resistance. So that could be walkouts, sick days, boycotts. I flagged this slow day because it made me think of Minnesota snow days. It was a technique that was used in Chile when they were fighting authoritarianism, and they succeeded, in which everybody just moved really slowly and did things really inefficiently. But it was diffuse because it was kind of hard to pinpoint whether somebody was protesting or not. And then, of course, we will see more targeted resistance as well. Strikes can be enormously effective. I put this picture on here of a story that I recently learned and loved about the Norway teacher strike during the Nazi occupation of Norway. They were instructed to start teaching Nazi ideology in schools, and they decided to strike instead. The teachers suffered tremendously. They were sent to labor camps, but the schools were also closed. And that meant that every single parent in Norway was clamoring for a reversal of the policy so that the kids could go back to school. And it was ultimately successful. We're also seeing more lawsuits, right? I flagged the 2 that we filed last week. We do sometimes put out kind of requests for plaintiffs in particular circumstances or situations. We had amazing volunteers come forward on the voter records case. And then we might be also putting out calls for more kind of targeted demonstrations or more specific concrete things. So keep an eye out. And sort of lastly, next slide, please. I put be creative. Effective civil resistance strategically targets the pillars of support that an administration is using to consolidate power, and it pushes back against authoritarian strategies to control people. The frogs in Portland, I mean, not only were they hilarious, but they actually also served a really practical purpose, because the administration was trying to say there's rioting and lawlessness in Portland. I'm going to need to invoke the Insurrection Act. We have to send in the military. Everybody needs to be suppressed there. And it was really hard to make that argument when most or all of the photos also involved people in frog suits. So on that note, right, be creative. I can't possibly think of all of the different ideas that might be effective civil resistance, particularly here in Hawaii. So next slide, please. I'm turning it over to Sergio for Q&A. We do have a lot of detailed, specific Know Your Rights trainings on our website. These slides, the recording of this presentation will be on our website, and then I put our contact information as well as a link to the ACLU intake form. So thank you so much.